extremely and particularly happy to have him today with us. A little bit about Dr. Schick. Dr. Schick holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has taught at Harvard University, MIT, and Istanbul Şehir University, as well as holding guest positions at Boston University, Sabancı University, and Boğaziçi University. He's the author of The Erotic Margins, Sexuality and Spatiality in Altruist Discourse, The Fair Circassian Adventures of an Orientalist Motive, Writing the Body, Society, and the Universe on Islam, Gender, and Culture. And he's the editor of European Female Captives and Their Muslim Masters, Narratives of Captivity in Turkish Lands, and the Book of Beauties in a New Style, Encomium for the Merchants and the Artisans of Istanbul. And he's the co-editor of Turkey in Transition, New Perspectives, and Women in the Ottoman Balkans, Gender, Culture, and History. His research interests include the Islamic arts of the book, gender, sexuality in particular, and spatiality, and the body in Islam, and animals, the environment in Islam. But we can add these like last two. He's currently working on a second doctorate at École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales in Paris. His dissertation concerns occult practices in Islam with special emphasis on their legitimation. So today, Dr. Schick will give us like a speech titled Ottoman Sexualities, How Studying the Past Can Help Build a Better Future. Ipek, thank you for being here once again, and I'm excited to listen to your speech.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you especially for organizing this conference. I really learned a great deal. We don't have a snowstorm here, but we have a serious rainstorm. So if the power should go out, well, I apologize in advance. If I lose my connection, I will try to get reconnected right away. So anyway, so let me begin. So if you were to ask people to name the most radical political statement made during the last couple of centuries, many people would probably cite Proudhon's Property is Theft, or perhaps Marx and Engels' Proletarians of the World Unite. My candidate would be quite different. I would say that the most radical political statement made in recent memory is a very famous line from a song in George and Ira Gershwin's opera, Porgy and Bess. And that line is, "It ain't necessarily so." I think this statement marks the beginning of all critical thinking and as well, the beginning of all transformative praxis. What appears to have always been true very often is not. And how better to demonstrate this fact than through historical research. Today, I will discuss some modern representations of sexuality during the Ottoman era in the context of some Ottoman self-representations. Note that it is very important to problematize the word representation. Sexuality itself is largely a representation, so that when one speaks of textual or visual representations of sexuality, one is speaking of second-order representations. In other words, representations of representations. My objective is to emphasize the difference between contemporary representations and the historical evidence in order to highlight the ways in which the idea of Ottoman sexuality has been instrumentalized in contemporary Turkish political discourse, and to show how this instrumentalization can be subverted and transcended. When it comes to Ottoman sexuality, there are essentially two distinct but complementary clusters of representations. One revolves around the essentially homosocial society of women in the harem, and the other around the essentially homosocial society of men in the public sphere. Many of these representations are mutually contradictory, but they still manage to coexist without invalidating each other. Indeed, this can be said to be one of the principal achievements of discourses of the other more generally. To illustrate, let me give you an example from a different context, namely India. Ezgi was just asking Nishant about British perceptions of Indian sexuality, and here is one. As some of you may know, there was a major rebellion against the British East India Company in 1857, generally known to British historiography as the Sepoy Mutiny. This event was a turning point in a number of interesting ways, notably in British perceptions of Indian sexuality. During the century preceding the uprising, numerous British publications had built an image of Indian men as insufficiently masculine as a result of environmental, racial, and social factors. Thus, for example, Robert Orme concluded his 1782 study, Historical Fragments of the Mughal Empire, of the Marathas, and of the English concerns in Hindustan, with the assertion that, and I quote, breathing in the softest of climates, having so few real wants, and receiving even the luxuries of other nations with little labor from the fertility of their own soil, the Indian must become the most effeminate inhabitants of the globe. And this is the very point at which we now see him, unquote. Of course, the alleged effeminacy of the male other was generally interpreted as implying his unfitness for self-government and therefore as justification for colonialism. As soon as the 1857 uprising broke out, however, and the colonial forces found themselves under threat, British public opinion was deluged with stories concerning the hyper-masculine, sex-starved Indian men who posed an imminent danger for British womanhood. In her powerful study of the trope of rape in British colonial discourse, Jenny Sharp observed that references to the Indian male as a rapist of white women did not occur in Anglo-Indian fiction and colonial records prior to the 1857 revolt, during which the crisis was, quote, managed through the circulation of the violated bodies of English women as a sign for the violation of colonialism, thus propagating fantasies of Oriental men desiring white flesh. Mutiny fiction enhanced the sexual coding of anti-colonial insurgency that is latent in the historical narratives, unquote. Sharp's assertion is significant in that it points to a new way in which sexuality was deployed in accordance with the exigencies of the political situation. Natives heretofore depicted as weak and effeminate suddenly became brutal rapists, as a heretofore acquiescent India rose up against the invaders. In this way, the anti-colonial struggle was reduced to savage brutality, and the repressive measures taken against it were legitimated as British masculinity defending its womenfolk's honor and safety. It seems that no one asked in 1857 how it was that those effete, unmasculine Indian men had suddenly turned into ultra-virile menaces to British womanhood. And likewise, the often contradictory images deployed in representations of Ottoman sexuality have not cast doubt on each other. In L'Archéologie du Savoir, published in 1969, Michel Foucault argued that a large group of statements that constitutes a discursive formation is characterized not by a unity of object, type of statement, conceptualization, or thematic, but rather by the presence of a regular system for the dispersion of these statements. It is, in other words, not necessary for a body of representations to be homogeneous or internally consistent, for it to constitute a discourse in the Foucauldian sense. What is necessary is that it be deployed in a systematic way. The contemporary discourse on Ottoman sexuality is such a systematically deployed body of representations that has been instrumentalized in a variety of ways, as I shall now try to describe. In March 1924, less than 6 months after the proclamation of the Republic, the Turkish magazine Resimli Ay published an article with the following very long title. I will skip the Turkish titles and just give you English translations. If anyone wants the Turkish titles, you can ask later. The title was, "The Palace was a source of fornication and scandal that harbored thousands of concubines in its midst." Resimli Ay, the illustrated month, was published by Zekeriya and Sabiha Sertel, an intellectual husband and wife team who had studied in Paris and New York and were at the time closely aligned with the National Liberation Movement. The article described in a fairly shrill tone how the Ottoman people had lived in abject misery while the sultans spent their time watching naked concubines frolicking in the pool of the harem, To give you an idea of its flavor, let me just cite a few sentences. Quote, "Until recently, we carried on our shoulders the weight of the pompous and grandiose past. Sultans whose names have been blotted out of history left us a legacy of thousands of concubines. How could we tolerate this life of misery and debauchery? Members of the imperial family who have now departed, leaving behind a homeland in ruins and a nation composed of orphans, choked in dissolute indulgence until recent days. The nation could not tolerate this life, which was a source of fornication and scandal," unquote. This was, of course, nothing but crass Republican propaganda, but what is most interesting is that it simply reproduced Western stereotypes about the harem and the Ottoman palace, stereotypes that were certainly no longer accurate if they ever had been. Even the illustration that accompanied the article was similar to countless Orientalist depictions of the seraglio. A book by a certain Ihsan, also published in 1924, was entitled The Adventure of Nazende, The Fornication, Lesbianism, and Countless Scandals of the Palaces. It told the gruesome story of a concubine sold into the Sultan's palace as consort to a prince, as well as the lives of her two children, including her daughter's liaisons with a matron and a eunuch, rape, and incest. Another book, this one entitled Mad Men in the Palaces, and written by a certain Fazl in Egypt, was published in 1929. It too represented life in the imperial household in highly sexualized terms, describing the alleged excesses of the depraved and debauched Sultan Ibrahim and his harem during the so-called Sultanate of Women in the 16th and 17th centuries. In other words, the article published by the Sertals was by no means an isolated case. The motif of Ottoman sexuality was used fairly systematically by Republican writers and ideologues to cast aspersions on the Ancien Regime. Of course, in that respect, they were far from original, and a notorious example of such practices is post-revolutionary France itself. A number of pamphlets and prints were published in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, focusing especially on the alleged sex lives of the deposed king and queen. In them, Louis XVI was generally depicted as impotent, thus simultaneously sexualizing his fall from power and casting doubt upon the legitimacy of the Dauphin, the crown prince. For her part, Marie Antoinette was represented as hypersexual, having relations with both men and women, ranging from lowly dragoons to the Marquis de Lafayette. This too suggested that the heir apparent was of dubious parentage, and indeed the Comte d'Artois was widely suspected of having been his father. Beyond casting doubt upon the legitimacy of the royal lineage, however, there was another important reason for the emphasis placed upon the royal couple's sex life. A change had occurred during the 18th century in the European perception of female sexuality, as the image of woman was transformed from one of willful carnality to one of idealized domesticity, as Mary Poovey has put it. Along with this transformation, societal differences, such as those imagined to lie along the axes of race, class, or gender, were recast as sexual differences. Thus, for example, while sexual desire was acknowledged to exist in some women, these came to be viewed as flawed by virtue of class, race, or some other characteristic. The sexuality of other women was thus an important constituent of the European bourgeoisie's self-construction, allowing it to disown characteristics it considered undesirable in itself by projecting them onto the other. The Kemalists' sexual portrayal of their Ottoman predecessors fulfilled an analogous function. But it also benefited from an additional historical factor, the motif of Oriental despotism. In his Structure of the Seraglio, published in 1979, Alain Gros-Richard argued that the notion of Oriental despotism was fundamentally sexualized, and that the Sultan's Seraglio as prison house of women, a site of absolute power so completely invested by sexuality, as he put it, served as a central trope in this discourse. It is into the domain of sexuality, he wrote, where it is rooted that Oriental despotism must be placed back in order to grasp its true nature and to assess the strength of the fascination it elicits. Likewise, the heart of Oriental despotic power, which rules over immense empires, hides within the very place where the despot exercises his domestic power, in that enclosed space forbidden to the gaze, saturated and structured by sex, the seraglio, unquote. In the late 19th century, Abdulhamid II, the so-called Red Sultan, provided the perfect example of this imbrication of sexuality and despotism, and was widely represented in those terms in European popular culture. The image of Sultan Abdulhamid II as sexualized despot was also appropriated in Turkey, as evidenced by several books published after he was deposed in 1909. With the proclamation of the Republic, the sexualization of Abdulhamid and of the Ottoman Empire more generally took on new meaning. Books like Haydar Galib's Sultan Abdulhamid's Debauchery, published in 1928, and Iskender Fahrettin Sertelli's Abdulhamid and Aphrodite, published in 1929, continued the practice of sexualizing the Sultan. If the Ottoman harem has insistently been represented as a locus of perverted, quote unquote, heterosexual desire, then the public sphere has invariably been depicted as a stage for perverted, again, quote unquote, homosexual desire. I am, of course, well aware of the fact that my use of this term in the context of Ottoman history is terribly anachronistic, and I will return to this matter later. For now, let me mention an essay serialized in the Kemalist newspaper İnkılap, or Revolution, beginning on the 5th of January, 1931. 2 weeks after the so-called Menemen incident, in which a young officer and 2 local watchmen were murdered by a crowd calling for a return to Sharia rule, the paper started to publish a polemical series entitled The Sultanate of Catamites. What is important here is the fact that this Kemalist publication launched an all-out attack against the country's past via the Ottomans' ostensible sexuality, namely pederasty. Interestingly, the author's primary focus was on the celebrated Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, and the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, probably the best-known member of that dynasty. He professed to regret having to do so, but there is no doubt that this choice was intended to discredit the country's Ottoman Islamic past by attributing widespread pederasty to it. It is also interesting that the author claimed Muslims had learned, in quotes, pederasty from the Persians, not from the Greeks, as is often stated. This suggests that in line with Kemalist attitudes, his intention was to demean the East while avoiding the ascription of something viewed unfavorably to Western culture. What is noteworthy about the essay is its ahistorical, anachronistic approach to such concepts as morality and sexuality. No thought appears to have been given to the fact that public mores change and that what is considered immoral at one time may have been seen in quite a different light at another. This is, in fact, typical of Republican attitudes to Ottoman sexuality, and there are very many examples. A notorious case is İsmet Zeki Eyüboğlu's Perverted Love in Ottoman Court Poetry, first published in 1968. A good 2/3 of this book are dedicated to a rather typically Kemalist overview of Ottoman classical or court poetry, compared and contrasted to Turkish popular poetry. Eyüboğlu then turns his attention to the motif of love in court poetry, stating that it came in 3 varieties. The first was mystical. It denoted love for God. The second was true love, in quotes, the love of the poet for a woman. Here, obviously, the poet was assumed to be male and straight, his love interest female and straight. And this is what true love meant to Eyüboğlu. He said, however, that both these expressions of love were abstract. The only concrete expression of love in court poetry, according to him, was pederastic love. He stated incorrectly, in my view, that Ottoman society considered this kind of love perverted, but that it was nevertheless widespread. His main quarrel was with modern literary historians who have persistently suppressed this homoerotic component of court poetry, sometimes going as far as to alter the works in order to make them appear to be heteroerotic. As some of you know, Turkish is not a gendered language, so there is often a certain ambiguity in these works that one can exploit to misrepresent their intended focus. In some instances, proper names or motifs like facial hair make it very clear that the object of the poet's attention is male. In other cases, however, it is only when placed in the proper context that the poet's sexual orientation becomes clear. What is noteworthy is that İsmet Zeki Eyüboğlu, no less than the conservative literary historians he criticized, looked at this material through the prism of modern heteronormativity. This was especially clear when he repeatedly qualified the sexual practices described in Ottoman poetry as perverted. Now, it is important to remember that his subject was not same-sex relations between consenting adults, but sexual relations between adult men and young boys. And certainly to our modern sensibilities, most people would consider sexual relations between an adult and a child to be wrong. But that does not mean that the same held for the producers and consumers of the poetry in question. A more recent book, less scholarly but equally prejudiced, is Pederasty Among the Ottomans by Rıza Zelyut, first published in 2016. A journalist, activist, and militant secularist, Zelyut is a typical representative of the nationalist wing of the Turkish left, epitomized by the newspaper Aydınlık, or Enlightenment, where he wrote until recently. And like Eyüboğlu's book, Zelyut too had an agenda that instrumentalized sexuality for the purpose of denigrating the Ottomans. After exhibiting in great detail the quote-unquote perverted sexuality of the Ottomans, he concluded, quote, "Today, the large majority of those who complain about republican laws and the equality granted to women are longing for pederasty, which constituted the foundation of the Ottoman moral system. Turkey is now at a crossroads. Either it will slide towards a system of pederasty that is being pushed under the guise of Ottomanism and religiosity, or it will turn towards the secular and democratic system that is the lifestyle of modern people. Turkey can only relegate the system of pederasty to the past by embracing secularism and democracy," unquote. I don't suppose that this totally absurd statement requires much commentary, save to emphasize the way in which a modern, moralistic outlook has been anachronistically projected onto an image of Ottoman sexuality, based, I might add, on literature and therefore of uncertain historical accuracy, in order to further present-day political objectives. Needless to say, such anti-Ottoman propaganda has not gone unanswered by political conservatives. Examples are too numerous to count, ranging from understating the prominence of the issue in the sources to desexualizing it by attributing it solely to Sufi expressions of divine love. I will not go into the denialist literature because, quite frankly, it is terribly boring. Instead, let me just cite Serkan Delice, who has summarized the issue perfectly. He writes that, quote, "A particular conception of the past is constructed through the mobilization of a combination of religious, imperial, and nationalistic references, an absolutely heteronormalized conception of the past that is expected to naturalize and render unchallengeable a heteronormative present that excludes those who are not heterosexual, that deprives them of the right to be visible and indeed to exist. In both colonies and recently founded nation states, the ex-post construction of a national past and historical heritage that serves heteronormativity is one of the most vital aspects of the education of the people, of the elimination of undesirable elements, and thus of the construction of patriotic, nationalistic, and heterosexual citizens faithful to the state, the army, and the family," unquote. In other words, heteronormativity transcends the boundaries of sexuality. It has been a building block in the construction of Turkey's illiberal nationalistic regime. Last year, on February 2nd, Turkey's far-right Minister of the Interior, Süleyman Soylu, made a series of statements in response to protests against the closure of the LGBT plus clubhouse at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. He said in part, and I quote, "What they call LGBT is something that does not agree with our values, that is not in harmony with this land, that has been served to us by the West. Did things like LGBT exist in our past? Is it that they existed and we just didn't know about it? These are things that exist in the West. This LGBT plus is something that Europe and the United States are trying to market to us. It can destroy our family structure. In my opinion, LGBT plus is perverted. Foreign forces are supporting it in order to destroy Turkey. The greatest power in this land is Islam," unquote. What he meant, of course, was not so much that these sexual orientations did not actually exist in Turkey's past, but rather that people of such orientations did not organize and demand their civil rights. Still, the way he presented his claims suggested that alternative sexual orientations are not only foreign and antithetical to Turkey and Islam, but that they have been weaponized by Turkey's adversaries and have the potential of destroying the country's traditional social fabric. Now, Soylu belongs not to the Islamist, but to the ultra-nationalist wing of the ruling coalition. And in his hostility to alternative sexual orientations, he is certainly in very good company. As you well know, whether in Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, or Frankist Spain, the outlawing and persecution of sexual minorities was an integral element of the government's political program, under the guise of preserving public morality, the health of the race, and/or the sanctity of the family. What is important to note is that in Turkey too, Soylu is far from alone in instrumentalizing sexual orientation. As we have seen, this practice has gone hand in hand with the instrumentalization of history more generally, starting no later than the early 20th century. In short, just as the attribution of universal sexual perversion, in quotes, to the Ottoman Empire helped the Kemalists define the new Turkey as its direct opposite, the heterosanitization of the Ottoman past has in turn helped the Turkish conservatives in constructing their own ideological and political hegemony as the modern continuation of Ottoman glory, in juxtaposition and opposition to the Kemalists. In both cases, anachronistic images of Ottoman sexuality have been instrumentalized for political capital. During the early years of the Republic, history was used, and more often abused, on the one hand to cast aspersions on the recent past, that is the late Ottoman Empire, and on the other to glorify the distant past, that is the semi-mythical Asiatic warriors from whom today's Turks are supposed to have descended and whom they are supposed to aspire to emulate. More recently, history has been used, and more often abused, in the service of conservatism, and more recently so-called neo-Ottomanism, whereby the Western-oriented modernizing Republican elites are denigrated and a semi-mythical Islamic golden age is exalted and put forward as the model to emulate. Now, the important point to note is that all this is not simply an academic matter. Such uses of sexuality reproduce sexism and heteronormativity, and even misogyny and homophobia in society at large, delegitimating alternative lifestyles and hurting real people in the process. Consequently, counteracting this material is not just an academic exercise. It is political at the most basic everyday level. And so the question that naturally poses itself is the following. How can we counteract these representations, undo the damage that they have done, and build a better society in which alternative lifestyles enjoy the space and receive the respect that they deserve? My answer is this. By demonstrating that the representations pervade in these ideologically driven statements and debates do not necessarily correspond to historical reality, we can show that things were not always the way they are today, and therefore that it is possible to imagine a different future. In other words, history can provide radical alternatives to the oppressive conditions of the present. For starters, let me briefly address the issue of terminology. As many of you know, the German term Homosexualität is both modern and Western. It was coined in or around 1868 by the Austro-Hungarian journalist and man of letters, Károly Maria Kertész. This brings to mind the question of how people might have conceptualized what we now think of as homosexuality or same-sex desire at a time when there was no word for it. Obviously, this is not to say that people did not engage in same-sex physical or romantic relationships before 1868. But we have to ask ourselves what meanings they ascribe to these relationships and how those meanings differ from those we ascribe to them today. As Frédéric Lagrange put it, quote, "The contemporary Western reader, who has never perhaps questioned his holistic conception of homosexuality, finds it sliced up into a multitude of role specializations, since medieval authors usually see no community of desire between, for instance, the active and the passive partners of homosexual intercourse," unquote. This is an extremely important point, and an examination of the sexual terminology used in Ottoman era literature suggests that precisely the same held for Ottoman and Turkish speakers, for whom homosexuality as an all-embracing term, covering partners, male as well as female, young as well as old, active as well as passive, simply did not exist. Instead, the Ottoman language is extremely rich in highly specialized words that describe specific participants fulfilling specific roles. This means that when speaking of Ottoman sexualities, positing a homo versus heterosexual dichotomy is anachronistic. What Ottoman sexual terminology shows is that there were indeed two distinct sexualities, but rather than a hetero-homosexual dichotomy, these sexualities were defined by penetrating and being penetrated. For a man who penetrates, whom he penetrates was considered to be of little consequence and primarily a matter of personal taste. The late 18th, early 19th century poet Sümbülzade Vehbi's Şevk Engiz, or ardor-inducing, is a debate between two men on the respective merits of sexual relations with women and with boys. It is quite symmetrical and non-judgmental, continuing a pattern going back through The Repeller of Sorrows and Dispeller of Cares by Deli Birader, 16th century, and The Book of Praise for Concubines and Slave Boys by El Jahiz, 9th century, to Erotes, or Lovers, by Lucian of Samosata of the 2nd century. What is noteworthy about all these works is that the relative neutrality with which their authors approach the issue. Today, with the exception of the most rabid homophobes, who maintain that those who define themselves as LGBTQIA+ are making a purely arbitrary choice that they could just as easily reverse. Most people consider a person's sexuality a fundamental and intrinsic part of his or her identity, so that one's preferred choice of sex object is not a matter of debate. Just as birds fly and fish swim, according to this view, some are compelled to choose partners of the opposite sex and others of their own. But this was not always the prevailing view. In his seminal History of Sexuality, which remained incomplete at the time of his death, Michel Foucault investigated the development of sexuality as a discursive construct subject to society's intellectual vicissitudes. In particular, he argued that homosexuality is a modern construct in the sense that what in the past had been viewed merely as a practice came during the 19th century to be considered an innate nature, an identity. I think Foucault's take is quite important in that it challenges the modern imbrication of sexuality and identity by historicizing it. And if things were different in the past, they can also be different in the future. So let us go back to the Ottomans. Was the Ottoman Empire a libertine paradise? Surely not. There were times when even the consumption of coffee and tobacco was prohibited, never mind other forms of recreation and leisure. The important point is that while there were always individual exceptions, overall what was censured was not specific sexual orientations, but rather indulgence more generally. For example, at the end of Sümbülzade Vehbi's Şevkengiz, the two protagonists fail to agree on whether women make the best lovers or boys. So they decide to consult the sheikh of a nearby dervish lodge. The sheikh listens to their arguments and declares both to be wrong. What they must do, he says, is to renounce earthly pleasures and concentrate on purifying their souls in preparation for the afterlife. I'm certain that this little detail was added to the poem to preempt attacks by prudish critics, but it is very important, I believe, that the man who prefers boys was not judged more severely than the man who prefers women. Both were considered to be prisoners of sensual passions and in need of spiritual redemption. Two colleagues and I have spent a good deal of time combing through Ottoman and early Anatolian Turkish texts, ranging from the mid-14th century to the mid-19th, in search of words of a sexual nature. The reason for limiting the chosen texts to pre-mid-19th century examples is that attitudes began to change fundamentally around that time, principally under European influence, so that new conceptions of gender and sexuality became normative in the course of cultural modernization in Turkey as elsewhere. The texts we have surveyed included compilations of proverbs, jokes, and tales, medical sexological treatises, and other works of prose, as well as collections of poetry. We have identified well over 650 words, nouns, verbs, and metaphors, and still have a long way to go. The prodigious wealth of this vocabulary shows that the Ottomans were not nearly as ascetic and puritanical as the current conservatives would have us believe. Among the books we have been examining are some known as Bahname, part medical, part erotic treatises, covering a wide range of subjects from taxonomies of genitalia to catalogues of sexual positions, from aphrodisiac recipes to risque anecdotes, from contraceptive measures to means of ensuring conception. Bahnames often made at least passing reference to same-sex desire, particularly male, and some were exclusively homoerotic. The best known among these is Deli Birader's Repeller of Sorrows and Dispeller of Cares, adapted in part from a Persian original entitled Elfiye ve Şelfiye, roughly of the penis and the vulva, by El-Azraki for the Ottoman Prince Korkut, the son of Sultan Bayezid II. Elfiye ve Şelfiye had originally been composed on the order of the Selçuk Emir Togan Shah of Nishapur, according to Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, who called it the most famous sotatic work of the Arabs and the Persians. So this was a book written on the order of a 12th century Muslim monarch, translated on the order of another late 15th century Muslim monarch, and intended for the entertainment and edification of his son, a Muslim prince. So much for the idea that all Muslims are puritanical. By far the most celebrated Bahname in the Ottoman realm was entitled Return of the Old Man to Youth Through the Power of Sex. This work was apparently based upon an Arabic original attributed to the 13th century Algerian man of letters Ahmed et-Tifashi. It was translated and adapted in 1519 on the orders of the Ottoman Sultan Selim I by a great religious scholar and jurist, the Shaykhul Islam Kemal Pashazadeh, also known as Ibn Kemal Pasha, who, by the way, was also the author of a number of fatwas concerning family law that shed light on love and desire during his age. The same text was also translated by another great scholar, the towering intellect of the 16th century Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Ali of Gallipoli, under the title Comfort of the Carnal Souls, for either Prince Mehmed, later Sultan Mehmed III, or his father, Prince Murad, later Sultan Murad III. Whichever is correct, this erotic classic too was translated by a religious scholar on the order of an Ottoman prince. At the turn of the 18th century, still another version was offered by Nati Mir Mustafa bin Hussein Pasha, And at about the same time, a fourth translation was produced by Mustafa Ebul Feyzet Tabib, the chief physician of the Sultan Ahmed Hospital in Istanbul, under the title Gift of Kings. This is an important version, by the way, for it appears to have provided a venue for some of the most sexually explicit Ottoman book illustrations known to us. With 4 different translations, tens of manuscript copies, and many printed editions, including one in Saudi Arabia, this immensely popular and important erotic work is divided into 2 parts. The first about men and the second about women. Although the introduction appears to have been written once again to preempt prudish attacks and states that the book was intended to excite sexual passion only in order to help believers obey the Prophet's command to marry and procreate, fully 1/2 of the book is homoerotic. Let me give you one final example. For a forthcoming book in Turkish on artistic and literary manifestations and expressions of desire, I have written an article on sexuality in Ottoman dream interpretation manuals. As some of you may know, dream interpretation is considered a legitimate religious science in Islam, as exemplified by the Prophet Yusuf, the Prophet Muhammad himself, and even some modern religious scholars like Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. Dream interpretation manuals are yet another fascinating source of information, if not on people's actual sexual doings, at least on how they thought and still think about sexuality. And these manuals contain many entries on same-sex relations, none of which pronounce negative judgment in any shape or form. Noting that Islamic dream interpretation is about predicting the future, not unlocking one's past psychological traumas, consider this entry from one of the best-known manuals, the early 18th century Syrian scholar Abdul Ghani an-Nabulusi's The Perfuming of Humanity Through the Interpretation of Dreams. Quote, if a man dreams that he's kissing a man, or being friendly with him, or lies with him with sexual passion, then he will be victorious over his wants and achieve his goal. And if the kiss is purely the result of sexual passion, then the kisser will receive something auspicious, like benevolence or scholarly training, or a well-esteemed item or guidance from the man whom he has kissed. And if the kiss is devoid of sexual passion, then the man who has been kissed will receive something auspicious or advantageous, like benevolence or the teaching of something, or guidance towards acquiring something licit. And if a man dreams of kissing a boy, then it means that affection will develop between the boy's father and himself. And if he dreams of kissing a concubine, then it means that he will become close friends with the concubine's master. And if he kisses a free woman, it indicates that he will become friends with her husband, unquote. In other words, if a man dreams of lying with and kissing another man, even if he kisses him lustfully, it only means that he will come into a good and beneficial transaction. And if he dreams of kissing a boy, a concubine, or a free woman, it only means that he will be friends with the boy's father, the concubine's master, or the free woman's husband. Anyone who expects that dreaming of same-sex relations would be given some terrible interpretation is bound to be very disappointed. So to conclude, when one recognizes that the Ottoman and early Anatolian Turkish languages contain a hugely rich vocabulary describing same-sex relations of every kind, that great Ottoman jurists and religious scholars composed explicit erotic classics featuring all sorts of same-sex relations for Ottoman princes and sultans. Sultans, by the way, were also caliphs, I'll remind you, and that dreams about same-sex relations were often given quite positive interpretations by religious scholars. It becomes very difficult to sustain Minister of the Interior Süleyman Soylu's preposterous claim that what they call LGBT is something that does not agree with our values, that is not in harmony with this land that has been served to us by the West. Drawing upon historiography to challenge such rubbish is what I had in mind when I titled this lecture, How Studying the Past Can Help Build a Better Future. There were times when society was more accepting of alternative lifestyles and sexual orientations than it is today. Things were not always as they are, and therefore we can and should aspire to build a better, more pluralistic, more inclusive future. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello.
Sure. Hi,
I
Vlad.
have a question. What did the sultans say about it?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I mean, the sultans did not leave behind, their thoughts about it. However, the fact that they commissioned all these translations and various books suggests that they had an interest in it, in the subject. We don't. I mean, for example, as I said, in some cases, sultans commissioned them for the education of their sons, the future sultans, the people they charged with translating them were not minor individuals. I mean, Ibn Kemal Pasha and Mustafa Ali of Gallipoli were really probably the most important religious scholars of their individual times. So when you look at this, we have to conclude that this was important to them. Now, I might mention that there is one copy of Ruju' Shaykh, of Return of to Youth Through the Power of Sex, at the Topkapı Library, whose images have been defaced. So this must have happened at some point. Some puritanical person must have done that. But at the same time, there are very many other manuscripts which are quite explicit, which were produced both for the palace and for individual patrons. And so, as I said, I don't want to give the false impression that the Ottoman Empire was a party for for everyone all the time. However, we are seeing that at least what people looked unfavorably was straying from spiritual pursuits, was doing worldly things. It was not who you slept with, but the fact that you slept with somebody instead of studying, the religious scripture. So I think this is what is important. Otherwise, certainly, drinking, sleeping around, all of those things were not looked upon favorably by very many people.
And is this literature Ottoman tradition, or was it at least partially imported from the Arabic world?
Well, this is actually a very good question. In many cases, these are translations of translations of translations. We know that many of these works came in Persian or Arabic versions, but they were themselves often translations of Indian works, Sanskrit or some other language spoken in India and written in India. And what we do know when you compare these works with each other is that they were not simple translations. They were actually adaptations. So there was a lot that was added to them. There was a lot that was removed. So I think it is okay to look at them as original works, based in part upon precedents in different languages.
But the concept, isn't the concept important? Okay,
Which
transformed, but still the idea that this thing is possible and you should look at it this way. As a prince, no? In Europe, you have the books written for the princes, education of the princes. But you never see something like this, which is so common in the Arabic literature and
I think there is one thing that we have to bear in mind, which is that in Christianity, corporality, the body, is the source of the fall, right? It's the source of the original sin that all of humanity has carried, and that Jesus came to eliminate, if you like. In Islam, there is no such idea. So the idea that the body is a source of sin is completely foreign to Islam itself. And so I think that is a very important distinction. I mean, I'm not saying that all mirrors for princes, these advice literature for Islamic sultans and princes were full of sex. They weren't. I mean, many of them were exclusively about politics and administration. However, as you pointed out, we do see that there were these advice books also given to princes so that they would learn about sex and have fun, frankly. I mean, these are not medical textbooks exclusively. They have very funny anecdotes in them. They have all sorts of stories. And so, I think that's, one of the principal differences is this different way of looking at the body and sexuality.
You can even turn around the page and ask, how did the sexual education of a Christian princes happen?
I have no idea, but yes, that is a worthwhile question to ask, certainly.
Thank you, Vlad, for your comments. Yeah, I should I see Zehra. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Ipek, for organizing this, and thank you, Irvin, for a very rich presentation. And you should interpret our silence after you stopped as being puzzled and still trying to process the rich information that you offered us. Well, as a political scientist, I have my own biases, so you have to excuse it as an intervention from a different discipline. The Soylu's rhetoric that you presented, we see it in Eastern Europe quite a bit as well, and also like during the Trump administration, in Brazil, the well, actually, in Eastern Europe, the language is that like being anti-gender. That is the right-wing populist. It's like all kinds of actually deviation from heteronormativity and lumped together. And the progress in favor of recognizing different gender identities and protecting them against violence attempt to be blocked and restricted. So Istanbul Convention is in epitome for this, like for that seen as promoting homosexuality, gender identity, and so on. And they come with also being anti-women. That is that. So in a way, we see this revival of advocacy of patriarchy and particular masculinity going together. But on the other hand, this is from the right wing, and you cited Kemalist leftist, and so examples from the past, and I thought of Soviet position regarding homosexuality. But while they have this kind of negative attitude towards sexuality and sexual freedoms and promiscuity, if you may call it, in the two, on the left, if we may say, we see promotion of women's rights. So I wonder if we can kind of, this my sketchy observation, if we can really generalize it as the, in terms of kind of like traditional right and left on the paradigm, if we can think about attack on sexualities and different gender identities and patriarchy, and upholding patriarchy and misogyny together on the right, and a bit separation on the left. Sorry, it was a bit, I'm still trying to process it myself. So I hope my point is came across. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. If I understood correctly, I agree with what you're saying. And I think a good example that immediately came to my mind is Ahmet Altan's novels, in which, for example, he criticizes the left for a certain asceticism which becomes misogynistic and anti-sex and anti-emotion and so forth. So I think, I mean, you and I are of an age, you being much, much younger than me, but still, we are of an age where we remember the times when the left in Turkey, when confronted with women's issues or with Kurdish demands, would say, yeah, now go and sit down. When the revolution comes, everything will be okay, so don't bother us. So I think the idea that these are all legitimate demands that should be addressed simultaneously, as opposed to waiting for the proletariat to make everybody happy. I think this is an idea that came rather late to Turkey and still hasn't reached many people on the left. So I think, you know, you're right on both sides. There are different but equivalent ways of instrumentalizing these ideas. And in a way, you know, that's basically what I guess I was trying to argue, that you know, we have seen different groups in Turkey instrumentalize different aspects of Ottoman sexuality in different ways to serve their own purposes, and that you know, it's incumbent upon ourselves to free ourselves from these. From these kinds of discourses and build a better society. I mean, I always remember, you know, Emma Goldman's "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." You know, I mean, if people can sleep with whoever they want to sleep, I don't want to be part of that revolution either. So it's, you know, I think I agree with you entirely.
I want to ask you, like, this correction of sexual representation of Ottomans starts before Kemalists, right? So also the Ottoman emperors tried to, after maybe like this tulip era, what people say is where Europe cherished this rich culture, then with this Orientalism, then Ottomans actually started to correct their image as well. So maybe Kemalists were just take this all the also new problematization of sexuality, and so I feel like I'm a bit. So it's kind of question. I think you took this question, and so in a broader context, I want to ask: did critic of Edward Said as well causes this eradication of sexual culture in our perception, or like it's already eradicated? So, do you think Edward Said's like critique of Orientalism caused also a repulsion from our erotic heritage. So
now, you're absolutely right that this started, as Guy pointed out, there's a famous report submitted to Sultan Abdulhamid II, which basically says that boy love is now everything of the past, that people who used to sleep with boys like Ali and Fuad Pasha are gone, and now the attention of young men has turned to women as nature dictates, he says. So I think by looking at the tone of this report, it's very clear that it is very Western in its outlook. So you're absolutely right that this was the heteronormativization started as a Western influenced process in the sort of third quarter, let's say, of the 19th century. About Edward Said, I mean, I bought Orientalism the year it appeared, and I devoured it within a matter of days, and I find him, and he changed my life. But there were aspects that were not, that he did not address. Obviously, he couldn't address everything. And I think, this is the gender and sexuality aspect he addressed in a very cursory and one-dimensional way. And I've tried to, in my book, The Erotic Margin, I tried to show that, in fact, the Orientalist way of looking at non-Western sexuality was much more diverse than he portrayed it to be. When he talked about the colonies being feminized, well, that was only one of many ways of looking at the colonies. However, this said, I think what Edward Said gave us is the tools with which to build the critique that we need to build in order to add to his work. So I think his work is extremely important, and we can use those tools to look at also Western ways of looking at non-Western sexuality, and vice versa, by the way. I mean, when you look at Turkish newspapers and the way they describe European women and European men and sexuality and all of that, you see that there is a sexual Occidentalism that is certainly very worth looking at. So thank you. Any other questions?
I just want to make a comment.
Please, Fajan.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. This was very, very enlightening. And I think really you have given us the facts, how history, the realities of history and then representations really of that reality don't always gel. They don't always coincide. So I think something we've learned both from Foucault and Said and also other philosophers is that representations, which is what you're really focused on, can be both implicit and complicit with ideologies. And this is a very important point. So we're looking at the present regime in Turkey that thinks that LGBT values are really in discord with our history, with our morals and so on. But we're looking at people, the people who are saying these things, of course, have no concept of history or reality and fact and fiction and so on and so forth. The issue here is if these representations of an instrumentalized sexuality are so endemic, how do we overcome this? We talk about the power of language and so on and so forth, but we're dealing with a regime that has no sense of language, no sense of, no sense of what representation means, no sense of history. I mean, we are in a small intellectual circle, academic circle. We're aware of the fact that representations are implicit and complicit with these ideologies, usually very regressive ideologies. And we write, you know, we have our little articles, we have our books. I'm not belittling them, by the way. I do a lot of that work. But how do we overcome this? How do we reach a larger public in whom representations are so endemic?
Well, I mean, I would say that this is a very valid question, but it also applies to any effort to change the status quo. I mean, we also want women to be liberated, and we also want all sorts of other things. And yet there are many things that are ingrained in society. Women's place is the kitchen and taking care of their children and whatever else. And how do we deal with this? Well, I think frankly, we deal with it piece by piece. I mean, we have to try and reach more and more people, as many as possible. But let me tell you how I came to this sort of work back in the 90s. My parents, well, I'm the product of a couple. The husband is European, and the wife is quote unquote Oriental, half Iraqi, Turkish-born mother, and a Czech father. And in my family, there were gender stereotypes, ethnicized gender stereotypes that I didn't come to realize until I had, grown up, where, my mother was the emotional one and my father was the logical one, and that was attributed to the Orient versus the West and all of that. And all of that as a child was what I grew up in. And the fact that I can look at these things now from outside and see how ridiculous they are shows that it is possible to overcome our upbringing. But I mean, you're absolutely right. A friend of mine once said that all the intellectual production of Turkey throughout history has been a small group writing letters to each other. I read your book, you read my book, and basically we think that we've changed the world. And obviously it's not that simple. But what else can we do? I mean, we try to reach as many people as possible. One of the things I do, for example, is I write on websites like Kaya Midart, for example, which is accessible to people, which doesn't mean everybody goes there, but at least more people go there than would be able to buy or be interested in buying my book. So I mean, that's it's a long process. We have to fight it because we don't have any alternatives. We have to fight this battle, but it's not going to be tomorrow that we're victorious.
I really appreciate you reiterating throughout your presentation the fact that if things were different in the past at some point, they can be different again. It's such an obvious point and so simple, yet it is so powerful. By repeating that, you're actually creating the hope, creating space for everyone to hope. And just as you were able to go back to sources in history and to give us this new body of work, and your book is about to come up, you said, and it's encouraging that it will younger scholars will be able to use your work. So what we put out there may be at first being shared amongst a smaller group of people, but it is certainly for the younger generations to find these sources and to move ahead. And there is always, after all, we're talking about sexuality here, and in terms of the popular press, there is, the topic itself has a certain appeal beyond just political appeal or scholarly appeal. So there are going to be echoes of this, certainly in the popular press as well, and it is going to be picked up, I think, You know, so I just wanted to thank you and you know, for the work. And also, I think I'm sort of reiterating my own belief and hope in the work.
And optimism.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I often feel there's a Turkish expression which you know, I'll translate for the non-Turks: "Kör kuyuya taş atmak," to throw a stone in a bottomless well. You know, you never hear the sound, right? The sound of the stone. Well, that's often how I feel. And then people like Ipek or Mehvesh come and say that they read my work, and this makes me infinitely happy. You know, hopefully, you know, well, here are at least 2 people who read my work, Ipek and Mehvesh, and at least, hopefully, at least 2 people, 3 people, Zahra raised her hand, and hopefully 3 people will read each of their works. So that will be, you know, it will grow geometrically. So that's the hope. Yani, otherwise, why are we doing this? I mean, you know, we have to hope that a better world is possible, because otherwise there is no point in living. You know, so I'm you know, intellectually pessimistic and politically optimistic.
I was just wondering, when you talk about this, you know, the heteronormalization process as a Western induced process, I'm always a bit, I always suspect that a bit. Like, is it really that? Was it really that easy? Like, you know, some Europeans commented on it and it happened. It just, you know, I know that you worked a lot with the early modern material. So I tried to argue that period, like the early modern developments in terms of politics and like literature in many fields, paved the way for the 19th, 20th century heteronormalization process. So as someone who worked with those texts much closely than I did, because I have no skills for doing that, to be honest, I was wondering how you think about that. Like, what is your take on it?
It's difficult to say. For example, you know, one French scholar suggested that if you look at Hijviye, at what's the English word for it? Tashlama Hijviye. Satirical works, thank you. Satirical, polemical works. You see that a lot of this polemics and satires are based on feminization or homosexualization, if there is such a word, and that in a way makes creates an identity, a you know, same-sex identity. I don't agree with that. I think that it's a very interesting point, but I don't agree in the sense that if I call somebody an idiot, that doesn't mean I'm creating an idiot identity. It just means I'm putting that person down. And obviously, at the time, being a male was the norm, you know, society-wise, and therefore, you know, emasculating, demasculinizing a man was considered to be an insult. That doesn't mean that there was a feminist consciousness or identity or anything like that. And I think the same goes for sexuality. Frankly, I haven't really seen any early material that leads to the kind of heteronormalization that we see in the 19th century. I mean, there are works where, you know, again, there are polemical works, or there are works like Chef Gengiz, where, you know, men will, the man who likes women puts down boy love, and the man who likes boys puts down, you know, heterosexuality. But that doesn't lead naturally to the idea that the norm is heterosexual, that not being heterosexual is wrong, is different, is weird, is whatever you want to call it. So I think that I mean, you know the recent past better than I do, and maybe you're right, but I haven't seen that trend building up towards the 19th century, frankly.
Thank you so much for your questions and staying with us up until this point. We started so early in the morning, and especially our presenters, Ezgi, you have been with us all day long, basically. And yeah, and I feel very happy. I feel very enlightened in many ways. So I just want to thank you all once again. This was all made possible by the program in Comparative Literature at UT Austin and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Department of Middle Eastern Cultures, again at UT Austin. We're going to continue talking about this, like this topic of queerness in the Middle East in other venues. Like I'm hoping to see you all like in different places, and really pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for being here and for your time in these like precarious times, mainly basically because you're all participating from different parts of the world. Before me getting boring and cliche, so I shall stop this like closing speech and thank Dr. Irvin Cemil Schick once again. Çok teşekkür ederiz burada olduğunuz için ve geldiğiniz için. Benim için çok büyük bir onur. Tekrar teşekkür ederim. Kendinize iyi bakın. Stay safe. Güvende olun, mutlu olun. Görüşürüz.